A widowed billionaire CEO reconnects with a mysterious woman he met at the bar last New Year's Eve, only to be sent into complete shock when he notices the baby in her arms. The city sparkled with the kind of cold brilliance only a winter night could bring. The streets, bustling with New Year's Eve revelers, were alive with the laughter of strangers and the occasional pop of fireworks in the distance. Matthew Cooper sat in his penthouse, staring out at the skyline through a wall of glass. His reflection stared back, a man who had everything and yet somehow felt utterly empty. It had been 2 years since his wife, Isabel, had passed away. 2 years of silence in a house once filled with warmth and laughter. 2 years of making decisions in boardrooms and retreating into the isolation of his grief. To the world, Matthew was the epitome of success, an empire builder, a man with influence and power. But inside, he was just a man trying to find his footing in a life that no longer felt like his own. Last year, in a rare moment of spontaneity, he had ventured out on New Year's Eve. His assistant had all but forced him to take a break from the endless grind, insisting he find something, anything, that would make him feel alive again. The idea had seemed absurd at first, but as the hours dragged closer to midnight, Matthew had found himself wandering into a bar nestled on a quiet corner of the city. That's where he met her. The bar was unassuming, filled with a mix of locals and visitors seeking refuge from the biting cold. Matthew had taken a seat at the end of the bar, nursing a drink and quietly observing the vibrant chaos around him. He had no intention of starting a conversation with anyone. Yet, when the bartender slid a second drink in front of him, he turned to find a woman sitting a few seats down, her eyes warm and curious. "You looked like you needed it more than I did," she'd said, lifting her glass in a playful toast. Her name was Samantha, and she had a way of speaking that made the noise of the bar fade into the background. She told him about how she had just walked away from a toxic relationship, a long-term partnership that had left her questioning everything. In her words, Matthew saw fragments of his own pain. He didn't share much about Isabel at first, not the specifics, but Samantha seemed to understand. She listened without judgment, her laughter and wit cutting through the heaviness he carried like sunlight through storm clouds. For hours, they talked about everything and nothing. She asked him about his favorite books, his most embarrassing moments, and what he would do if he weren't running a billion-dollar corporation. He asked her about her favorite places to travel, her childhood dreams, and what made her decide to walk away from her old life. The connection was unlike anything Matthew had felt in years. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, at least not at first. It was two people, lost in their own ways, finding a moment of solace in each other. When the clock struck midnight, they clinked glasses and laughed at the absurdity of two strangers celebrating together. Then, just as the night seemed to be drawing to a close, Samantha leaned in and said, "How about this? Same time, same place, next year. If we're both still single, we'll meet here again." Matthew had chuckled, thinking it was just a playful suggestion, but the sincerity in her eyes stopped him. "Deal," he'd said, raising his glass one last time. Or so he thought. His last glass became 2, then 3, and before he knew it they were calling a taxi to his place. It was a passionate night that made him momentarily forget about the past 2 years, but it didn't last. Before the clock struck 6, Samantha had gathered her things and was on her way, and with that she disappeared into the night, leaving him with nothing more than a fleeting sense of hope and the faintest trace of her perfume lingering in the air. Now, as another New Year's Eve loomed, Matthew found himself unable to shake the memory of that night. He had thought of Samantha more times than he cared to admit, replaying their conversation in his mind like a favorite song. There was something about her that had stayed with him, a warmth, a vitality, a reminder that life could still surprise him. But was he ready to face it again? The idea of returning to that bar, of potentially seeing her again, filled him with equal parts excitement and dread. What if she wasn't there? What if she was, but the connection wasn't the same? What if she had moved on and he was just a foolish man clinging to a fleeting memory? He ran a hand through his dark hair, now peppered with streaks of gray, and sighed. His sister, Claire, had called earlier, urging him to go. "You've spent 2 years burying yourself in work, Matthew," she'd said. "You deserve to be happy. And if this Samantha made you feel even a fraction of that, you owe it to yourself to find out." Claire always had a way of cutting through his excuses. She'd been there for him after Isabel's death, coaxing him out of the worst of his grief and reminding him that life didn't end just because hers had. But Matthew wasn't sure if he could risk the disappointment of showing up at that bar only to find himself alone again. Still, as the evening stretched on, he found himself pulling out a crisp navy suit and slipping it on. The decision felt both impulsive and inevitable. He couldn't sit in his penthouse and let another year pass him by. If Samantha wasn't there, he'd leave and chalk it up to a lesson in letting go. But if she was? The bar was just as he remembered it, warm, unpretentious, a refuge from the bustling streets. As he stepped inside, the hum of laughter and music enveloped him, and for a moment, he felt like he was stepping back in time. His eyes scanned the room, heart pounding as he searched for her face among the crowd. Samantha wasn't there. Not yet, at least. Matthew slid into the same seat he'd occupied the year before, his mind a flurry of hope and doubt. He ordered a drink, his fingers tapping nervously against the glass as the minutes ticked by. Midnight was still an hour away, but the anticipation felt unbearable. A sudden laugh from across the room drew his attention, and for a brief, electrifying moment, he thought it was her. But when he turned, it was just another stranger, lost in their own celebration. He exhaled, trying to quiet the rising tide of disappointment. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe the connection they'd shared had been a fleeting spark, destined to burn out the moment it was tested by time. But as he glanced at the clock and saw the hands inch closer to midnight, a small, stubborn part of him refused to give up hope. Because sometimes, just sometimes, life had a way of surprising you. And as much as Matthew tried to guard himself against it, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was meant to be one of those nights. Matthew's eyes lingered on the clock, the hands moving steadily closer to midnight. The drink in his hand had gone untouched for longer than he realized. The hum of the bar, the bursts of laughter, and the clinking of glasses all blended together in the background, yet none of it registered. His mind was locked on the promise, on Samantha, and the question that had gnawed at him for the past year: would she come? The seat next to him was empty, just as it had been when he arrived. Every time the door opened, a gust of cold wind sweeping in, his heart leapt, only to sink moments later when it wasn't her. He wasn't even sure what he would say if she walked through that door. What did one say after a year? After sharing a night so raw, so full of unspoken understanding, only to walk away with nothing but the echo of a promise? The bartender, a wiry man with sharp eyes, approached with a knowing smile. "Need a refill?" he asked, nodding to Matthew's glass. Matthew shook his head. "I'm good. Just waiting." The bartender's smile widened. "Aren't we all?" He walked away, leaving Matthew to stew in his thoughts. Matthew couldn't help but reflect on the hours leading up to this moment. He hadn't made the decision to come easily. Claire had been the one to finally push him over the edge. She'd called earlier that morning, her voice bright and teasing, as though she knew he'd been avoiding her calls for a reason. "So," she'd said, "what's the plan for tonight?" "Let me guess, another thrilling night of spreadsheets and stock reports?" Matthew had sighed, already bracing himself. "I'm thinking about it, Claire. I just don't know if I should." "Thinking about it?" she'd scoffed. "Matthew, this isn't a board meeting. It's one night. One promise. You're overcomplicating this because you're scared." "Maybe I am," he'd admitted. "But what if she's not there? Or worse, what if she is, and everything's changed?" Claire had paused, her tone softening. "Everything's always changing, Matthew. That's the point. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. You deserve something good, even if it's just one night. Go." And so, he had come, half convinced he would leave the bar with nothing but the sting of disappointment and a deeper sense of loneliness. But now, with less than 10 minutes until midnight, the weight of Claire's words settled heavier on him. If she wasn't here, he could live with that. but he wasn't sure he could live with the regret of not showing up. Then the door opened again, and this time, everything stopped. Samantha. She stepped inside, her coat dusted with snowflakes, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She looked almost exactly as he remembered, soft curls falling around her shoulders, her smile as warm as the glow of the bar's golden lights. But there was something different, something he hadn't anticipated. In her arms, bundled tightly in a blue blanket, was a baby. Matthew froze, his chest tightening. The glass in his hand felt suddenly too heavy. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, shock, confusion, or something far more complicated. All he knew was that in an instant, every scenario he'd imagined crumbled into uncertainty. She hadn't noticed him yet. Samantha moved toward a small table near the corner of the bar, her movements careful and practiced as she shifted the baby in her arms. She glanced around, her expression hopeful but tinged with nerves. When her eyes landed on him, the smile that lit up her face was unmistakable. "Matthew," she said, making her way toward him. Her voice carried over the noise of the bar, grounding him in a way nothing else could. The baby gurgled softly, oblivious to the weight of the moment. He rose to meet her, his movements slow, hesitant. "Samantha," he said, his voice catching in his throat. "You're here." "Of course I am," she said, her smile widening. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I almost didn't," he admitted, his eyes flickering to the baby. "It's good to see you." Her smile faltered slightly, as though she could sense the unspoken question hanging in the air. She glanced down at the baby, her arms tightening protectively. "This is Oliver," she said softly. "My son." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. He searched her face for some kind of explanation, but her expression remained calm, almost apologetic. He tried to form words, but nothing came out. His mind raced with questions, assumptions, fears. "You have a son," he finally managed, his voice quieter than he intended. She nodded, her smile turning bittersweet. "Yes. He's 3 months old." Matthew felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. He wanted to ask so many things but didn't know where to start. The one question that loomed above all the others burned on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. As if sensing his struggle, Samantha's expression softened. "He's not yours, Matthew," she said gently, her voice steady. I got back together with someone after we met. It didn't work out, but Oliver came from that." Relief and confusion warred within him. He nodded, trying to process her words, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the clarity of her answer left him feeling hollow. "Right," he said, forcing a smile. "I'm glad you're doing well." Samantha's brow furrowed, and for a moment, it looked like she might say something more. But then Oliver squirmed in her arms, letting out a small whimper that drew her attention. She soothed him instinctively, her focus shifting entirely to the baby. Matthew watched her, his emotions swirling in a chaotic mix. She was here, just as they had promised, but everything felt different. The easy connection they'd shared a year ago now felt clouded by the reality of their separate lives. Samantha looked up at him again, her expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to throw you off," she said softly. "I wasn't sure if I should come tonight, but I wanted to see you." Her honesty cut through the noise in his head. For all the confusion and unanswered questions, he couldn't deny that he wanted to see her, too. "I'm glad you came," he said, and for the first time that night, he meant it. As midnight approached, the bar erupted into a countdown. Matthew and Samantha stood together, the noise and lights washing over them, but the moment felt fragile, uncertain. When the clock struck 12, the room burst into cheers, but Matthew's focus remained on Samantha and the child in her arms. She smiled at him, her eyes holding a flicker of the warmth he remembered, but also something deeper, something that left him feeling like he was standing on the edge of a precipice. "Happy New Year, Matthew," she said, her voice soft, her words filled with meaning he couldn't quite grasp yet. "Happy New Year, Samantha," he replied, though the words felt heavy on his tongue. And as the fireworks lit up the night sky, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. As the clock ticked past midnight, Matthew felt a growing unease rumble inside. Struggling to keep his emotions in check, he asked again the question that hovered, unspoken, between them. Is he? He trailed off, not daring to finish the sentence. The air between them felt impossibly heavy, and he swore he could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears. Samantha's eyes widened slightly as she realized what he was asking. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as though weighing her response carefully. Finally, she shook her head, her voice soft but firm. No, Matthew. I told you, he's not yours. The tension in Matthew's shoulders eased slightly, but only just. Relief mixed uneasily with confusion, and his thoughts felt like a tangled web he couldn't unravel. I see, he said, though he didn't. Not really. Samantha hesitated, shifting Oliver in her arms again as she continued. Like I said after we met, I got back together with someone briefly. It didn't work out, but, well, Oliver came from that. Her tone was calm, almost rehearsed, but there was a flicker of something beneath it, an unease she couldn't quite hide. Matthew nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the floor. He wanted to believe her, and yet a part of him couldn't help but wonder why she felt the need to explain herself so carefully. Was she being truthful, or was there something she wasn't saying? That must have been a lot to handle, he said, forcing himself to look back at her. The words felt hollow, but he didn't know what else to say. It was, Samantha admitted, her voice quieter now. But he's worth it. He's everything. Matthew studied her face, searching for some hint of regret or sadness, but all he saw was love. It was the kind of love that transcended words, the kind that made her entire being soften as she glanced down at her son. It should have made him happy for her. It should have filled him with some measure of peace. But instead, it left him feeling hollow. The silence between them stretched, growing more awkward by the second. Samantha shifted nervously, her confidence from earlier fading under the weight of his unspoken thoughts. Matthew, He cut her off, his voice tight and restrained. I should probably let you get back to whatever plans you have. Samantha blinked, her expression falling slightly. I didn't come here with plans. I came to see you. Her honesty made his chest ache, but it wasn't enough to pierce through the wall of emotions threatening to swallow him whole. I don't think this is a good idea, he said, his words clipped and rushed. It was nice to see you again, Samantha. Really. But I should go. Her face crumpled for a brief moment before she caught herself, her features settling into a mask of calm. Matthew, wait. He didn't wait. He couldn't. Every fiber of his being was screaming at him to leave before he said or did something he couldn't take back. Without another word, he turned and made his way to the door, the cool winter air rushing in to meet him as he stepped outside. The cold stung his face, but it did nothing to clear the storm raging inside him. He walked aimlessly for several blocks, his breath visible in the icy night. The city's vibrant lights blurred into a haze as his thoughts spiraled, replaying the brief conversation over and over. He didn't know why he'd reacted the way he had. Samantha had done nothing wrong. She had shown up, just as she'd promised, and had even been honest about her life and the changes that had occurred. She'd given him no reason to feel betrayed or hurt, and yet that's exactly what he felt, an inexplicable sense of loss for something that had never truly been his. Matthew stopped on a quiet street corner, leaning against a lamppost as he let out a shaky breath. He wanted to go back, to apologize, to explain the mess of emotions he didn't fully understand himself. But he couldn't bring himself to move. The thought of facing her again, of seeing the hurt he'd caused written across her face, was too much. Instead, he stood there, letting the cold seep into his skin as the sounds of the city buzzed around him. For the first time in a long while, Matthew Cooper didn't know what to do. And that terrified him more than anything else. The biting cold clung to Matthew as he wandered the streets aimlessly, the weight of the evening pressing heavily on his chest. The memory of Samantha's face, the flicker of hurt when he walked away, refused to leave him. He'd been quick to retreat, too overwhelmed to process the swirl of emotions Samantha's presence, and Oliver's, had stirred. Now, under the harsh light of street lamps, regret was setting in. By the time he returned to his penthouse, the city had already transitioned into the early hours of a new year. The celebratory fireworks were long over, replaced by the quiet hum of a world slipping into a deep, contented sleep. But Matthew felt none of that contentment. His mind was a storm. He didn't want to be alone with his thoughts, so he called Claire. She picked up on the second ring, her voice groggy but concerned. "Matthew? It's late or early, I guess. Are you okay?" He hesitated before answering, his voice low and uneven. "I went to the bar." Claire exhaled audibly, waking up fully now. "And? Did she show up?" "She did," he said, sinking into the leather couch in his living room. "But it's not what I expected." "What do you mean?" Matthew paused, the memory of Samantha cradling Oliver flashing through his mind. "She has a son. She said he's not mine." She got back together with someone after we met, and Oliver came from that." Claire was silent for a moment, likely choosing her words carefully. "How do you feel about that?" "I don't know," he admitted, rubbing a hand across his face. "Confused. Maybe even a little hurt. Which doesn't make sense because she didn't owe me anything. We weren't. It was one night. One night that clearly meant something to you," Claire pointed out gently. "You've been thinking about her for a year, Matthew. That's not nothing." He didn't respond, the truth of her words settling uncomfortably in his chest. "And this baby," Claire continued, her tone thoughtful. "Did you believe her when she said he's not yours?" Matthew frowned. "Why wouldn't I?" "I don't know," Claire said cautiously. "It's just, from what you've told me, Samantha doesn't strike me as the kind of person to show up unless she thought it mattered. Maybe there's more to the story than you realize." Matthew leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Claire had a way of planting seeds of doubt that refused to be ignored. He wanted to dismiss the idea outright, but the look in Samantha's eyes when she'd spoken lingered in his mind. There had been something there, hesitation perhaps, or fear. "Even if there is," he said after a long pause, "it's not my place to push. She made her decision. And you made yours by walking away," Claire countered. "But Matthew, if there's even a chance she wasn't telling the whole truth, don't you think you owe it to yourself, and her, to find out?" The conversation ended shortly after, but Claire's words stayed with him, following him into restless sleep and through the next morning. By the time he'd showered and attempted breakfast, the gnawing feeling in his gut had only grown stronger. Across town, Samantha sat on her couch, the sunlight streaming through the windows doing little to lift her spirits. Oliver dozed peacefully in her lap, his tiny chest rising and falling in time with her own measured breaths. But her mind was anything but calm. She replayed the events of the night before, each moment with Matthew etched vividly in her memory. She had been so sure that seeing him again would bring clarity, that their connection would somehow make the messy, complicated parts of her life feel manageable. Instead, it had only made things harder. Lying to him about Oliver's paternity had been the only choice she thought she had. Matthew's world was so far removed from hers, and she couldn't imagine dragging him into the chaos of single parenthood. He had a life, one that didn't need the complications she came with. And yet, when she'd seen him standing there, so familiar and yet distant, something inside her had ached. She wanted to tell him the truth. She wanted to tell him that Oliver was his, that their brief connection had led to something unexpected and beautiful. But she hadn't been able to do it. Fear had silenced her. Now, as she watched Oliver stir awake, his bright eyes blinking up at her, she couldn't shake the guilt. He deserved to know his father, and Matthew deserved the truth. But how could she risk opening that door when Matthew had already walked away? Later that afternoon, as Matthew sat in his office, scrolling absently through emails he had no intention of answering, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brows furrowing at the unfamiliar number. After a moment's hesitation, he answered. "Hello?" Matthew Cooper? A woman's voice asked, hesitant but clear. Yes. Who's this? My name is Rachel, she said. I'm a friend of Samantha's. Matthew straightened in his chair, his pulse quickening. How did you get my number? Samantha mentioned you once, Rachel admitted. And well, I found your company's website. I hope you don't mind me calling. He wasn't sure what to say, so he waited, the silence on the line growing heavy. I don't want to overstep, Rachel continued, but I felt like I needed to tell you something. Last night, after Samantha came home, she seemed really upset. She didn't tell me much, but I know her well enough to know when she's holding something back. Matthew frowned, his grip tightening on the phone. What are you trying to say? Rachel hesitated before finally blurting it out. Matthew, Oliver is your son. Samantha's scared to tell you, but I thought you deserved to know. The words hit him like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. What? He asked, his voice sharp. How do you know that? She told me when she found out she was pregnant, Rachel said softly. She was terrified, Matthew. She didn't know if you'd want to be involved or if she should even tell you. But I think it's eating her up inside. Matthew's mind raced, the pieces clicking together with a clarity that left him reeling. The timeline, the hesitation in Samantha's eyes, the guarded way she'd spoken last night, it all made sense now. I don't know why she didn't tell you, Rachel added. But if you care about her and Oliver, you'll go talk to her. Matthew ended the call, his hand trembling as he set the phone down. His heart was pounding, a mixture of shock, anger, and something else he couldn't yet name. He thought back to Samantha's words, the way she looked at him when she said Oliver wasn't his. She'd lied. But more than that, she'd been afraid. Afraid of what he'd say, of how he'd react. And now, standing in his office, Matthew realized he couldn't walk away this time. Not without knowing the truth. The next morning, Matthew stood outside Samantha's apartment building, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. The city was quieter now, the bustle of New Year's celebrations replaced by the hum of everyday life. Yet for him, everything felt electric, his nerves taut as he stared at the worn brass buzzer in front of him. He'd barely slept after Rachel's call. The revelation had shaken him to his core, but it had also filled him with a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. Samantha's silence about Oliver wasn't something he could accept without understanding why. He needed answers. He needed the truth. Finally, summoning his courage, he pressed the buzzer labeled S. Grayson. A few seconds later, her voice crackled through the intercom. Hello? It's Matthew, he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Can we talk? There was a long pause, one that made him wonder if she might send him away. But then the door buzzed, and he stepped inside. When she opened the door to her apartment, Oliver was in her arms, his bright eyes wide with curiosity. Samantha looked tired, her hair pulled into a loose bun, but there was still warmth in her expression, even if it was cautious. Matthew, she said, stepping aside to let him in. I wasn't expecting you. I wasn't planning to come, he admitted, his eyes flickering to Oliver before meeting hers. But we need to talk. She hesitated, her arms tightening instinctively around her son. All right, she said quietly, leading him to the small living room. The apartment was modest but cozy, filled with soft colors and toys scattered across the floor. It was a sharp contrast to his sleek, minimalist penthouse, and yet it felt more alive than his home had in years. Matthew sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. I know, he said finally, breaking the silence. Samantha froze, her eyes narrowing slightly. Know what? About Oliver, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. I know he's my son, Samantha. Her face paled, and she sank into the chair opposite him, holding Oliver close as though he might slip away. Who told you? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Does it matter? He asked, his tone softening. You should have told me, Samantha. Why didn't you? Tears welled in her eyes, and she looked away, her fingers brushing lightly over Oliver's dark curls. "I was scared," she admitted after a long pause. "When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know what to do. Your life is so different from mine, Matthew. You've built this empire, and I'm just me. I didn't want to complicate your life." "You think I wouldn't have wanted to know?" he asked, his voice catching slightly. "You think I wouldn't have wanted to be there for you, for him?" "I didn't know," she said, tears spilling over now. "You lost Isabel. I saw the pain in your eyes when we met. I didn't want to add to that, or worse, be rejected. So I convinced myself it was better this way. Safer." Matthew exhaled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. He couldn't deny that she had a point. His life was far from ordinary, and the grief he'd carried after Isabel's death had been overwhelming. But that didn't change the fact that he'd missed 6 months of his son's life. "I wish you'd given me the chance to decide," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because I would have been here, Samantha. No matter what." Samantha broke then, her quiet sobs filling the space as Oliver squirmed in her arms. Matthew leaned forward, his hand brushing hers in a gesture of comfort. It was a small thing, but it seemed to anchor her, and slowly, her breathing steadied. "I'm sorry," she said, looking up at him. "I know I should have told you. I was wrong." Matthew nodded, his chest tightening. "We can't change the past," he said, glancing at Oliver, who was now gazing at him with curious eyes. "But we can figure out where to go from here." The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. Matthew began spending more time with Samantha and Oliver, navigating a world that was both unfamiliar and unexpectedly fulfilling. It started small, short visits where he'd learn how to hold Oliver properly or make him laugh with silly faces. But as the days turned into weeks, his bond with his son grew deeper. He marveled at the way Oliver's tiny hand would curl around his finger, the sound of his giggles filling the room like music. For the first time in years, Matthew felt a sense of purpose that went beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. Samantha, too, began to let her guard down. She watched as Matthew eased into fatherhood, her heart softening with each passing day. But despite the growing closeness between them, a part of her still held back. One evening, as they sat on the floor playing with Oliver, she finally voiced her fears. "I don't want you to feel obligated, Matthew," she said, her voice hesitant. "To be here. To be with us." Matthew looked at her, his brow furrowing. "Obligated?" he repeated. "Samantha, I'm here because I want to be. Because this is where I'm supposed to be." She smiled faintly but didn't respond, her doubts still lingering beneath the surface. Matthew could see it in her eyes, the way she braced herself for disappointment, as though she didn't quite believe happiness could last. As much as Matthew wanted to reassure her, he couldn't ignore the challenges that lay ahead. Balancing his demanding career with his newfound responsibilities as a father was no small feat. His days were now a careful juggling act, split between meetings with investors and afternoons spent building block towers with Oliver. There were moments when the pressure threatened to overwhelm him, when he wondered if he was doing enough or if he was in over his head. But then Oliver would reach for him with tiny, trusting hands, or Samantha would smile at him in that quiet, knowing way, and it would remind him why it was all worth it. Still, the unspoken tension between them remained, a shadow over their growing connection. Matthew knew Samantha was afraid to trust fully, and he couldn't blame her. He hadn't exactly made it easy for her to believe in him. But he also knew one thing for certain, he wasn't going to walk away. Not from her, and certainly not from Oliver. He just needed to find a way to show her that. And deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough to simply say the words. He would have to prove it. With time, with patience, and with love. For both of them. The weeks passed, and life began to settle into a rhythm, though not without its challenges. Matthew divided his days between his high-stakes business meetings and quiet moments at Samantha's apartment, building a relationship with his son. The connection between them deepened with each visit. Oliver had started to recognize Matthew, his little face lighting up with a gummy smile whenever Matthew walked through the door. It was a joy that Matthew hadn't known he could feel again. But as the weeks turned into months, the underlying tensions between him and Samantha began to surface. For all the moments of laughter and shared warmth, there were cracks in their fragile arrangement. Samantha still held part of herself back, and Matthew, ever the problem solver, couldn't help but want to fix it. One evening, as Oliver napped in his crib, they sat at the small kitchen table in Samantha's apartment. A conversation that had started off light took a sharp turn when Matthew brought up his thoughts on Oliver's future. "I've been looking into schools," Matthew said, his tone casual, though his words carried weight. "There's a great early learning center near my place. It's one of the best in the city." Samantha looked up from her cup of tea, her brows furrowing slightly. "Your place?" "Yes," Matthew said, leaning forward. "It would make sense. It's closer to my office, and they have resources that Oliver could really benefit from." We?" Samantha interrupted, her voice sharper now. "Matthew, are you suggesting that Oliver and I move into your world?" Matthew paused, sensing the shift in her tone. "Not immediately," he said, carefully choosing his words. "But we should start thinking long-term. Oliver deserves the best opportunities, and I can provide that." Samantha set her cup down, her expression tightening. "I appreciate that you want what's best for Oliver, but we're doing fine here." "Fine?" Matthew repeated, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. "Samantha, this isn't about fine. It's about giving Oliver every advantage, every opportunity to thrive." "And you think I can't do that?" she snapped, her voice rising. "Just because I don't live in a penthouse or have a corporate empire doesn't mean I can't give my son a good life." "That's not what I'm saying," Matthew said, his voice firm but steady. "But you can't deny that I can offer him things you can't." Her eyes flashed with anger, and she stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen. "And there it is," she said bitterly. "The power imbalance. The control. You think just because you have money, you get to dictate how we live?" Matthew rose to his feet, frustration boiling over. "This isn't about control, Samantha. It's about being practical. About planning for the future." "No," she said, her voice shaking. "It's about you trying to fit us into your world, your way, without considering how that might feel for me." Matthew took a step closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "You think this is easy for me? I'm trying, Samantha. I'm trying to be here for Oliver, for you. But every time I take a step forward, you push me back. What are you so afraid of?" Samantha froze, his words cutting through her like a blade. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and pain. "You want to know what I'm afraid of, Matthew? I'm afraid of getting used to you being here, only for you to decide one day that it's too much. That we're too much." "That's not going to happen," Matthew said, his voice low and steady. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." "You say that now," she shot back, her voice trembling. "But you have no idea what this life is like. The sleepless nights, the sacrifices. And I won't let Oliver grow up thinking he's someone's obligation." Matthew's heart clenched at her words, the accusation cutting deep. "Is that what you think? That I'm here out of obligation? I don't know what to think," she admitted, tears spilling down her cheeks. "All I know is that this is my life, and I've been doing just fine without you. I don't need you to swoop in and take over." For a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of the argument hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Samantha wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "I think you should go," she said softly, her voice breaking. Matthew's chest tightened, his instincts screaming at him to argue, to fight for her, for Oliver. But the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't just anger or frustration, it was fear, raw and unguarded. "Samantha," he started, but she shook her head. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just go." He hesitated, his feet feeling like lead, but eventually he turned and walked toward the door. Every step felt like a betrayal, like he was walking away from the very thing he'd promised not to leave. When he reached the door, he glanced back, hoping for some sign that she might change her mind. But Samantha had turned away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Matthew stood in the hallway, his heart heavier than it had been in years. He wanted to go back, to fix what had just broken, but he knew it wasn't that simple. Samantha's walls had been built long before he entered her life, and breaking through them would take more than words. As he stepped into the cool night air, the weight of the argument pressed down on him. For the first time in months, he felt truly lost. All he could do now was hope that this wasn't the end, that somehow, some way, they could find their way back to each other. But for now, all he could do was walk away. The days that followed their argument were some of the longest Matthew had experienced in years. He went through the motions of his work, sitting through meetings, signing documents, and reviewing reports, but his mind was far from the corporate world. The image of Samantha, her face streaked with tears, haunted him. Her words, sharp and full of pain, echoed in his head. Each night, he returned to his penthouse and sat alone, replaying every moment they'd shared. The silence felt heavier now than it ever had before, not just because of Samantha's absence, but because of Oliver's. His son. The thought still filled him with awe, and now, with an ache that refused to subside. One evening, as Matthew sifted through the sparse contents of a small drawer in his bedroom, his hand brushed against something unfamiliar. He pulled it out, a folded piece of paper worn at the edges, tucked between two books he hadn't opened in years. It took him a moment to remember where it had come from. The bar. He had forgotten about it entirely, the little note Samantha had slipped into his coat pocket on the night they'd met. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it, the faded ink scrawled in her delicate handwriting. Matthew. I don't know if we'll ever meet again, but if we don't, I just want to say thank you. For listening, for laughing, for helping me remember that life can still surprise me. I hope you find happiness again. You deserve it. Samantha. The note was short, simple, yet it hit him like a tidal wave. He could see her in his mind, sitting at the bar that night, her smile tentative but genuine. She had been vulnerable, uncertain about her own future, but still brave enough to reach out and make a connection. She had believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. Matthew set the note down, his chest tightening. He had been so focused on his own fears, of rejection, of failure, of not being enough, that he hadn't stopped to think about how much courage it had taken for Samantha to let him into her life, even briefly. And when she needed him to prove he was there for the long haul, he'd walked away. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as clarity settled over him. Samantha had been afraid, yes, but so had he. If he truly wanted to build a life with her and Oliver, he had to stop expecting her to come to him. He needed to show her, really show her, that he wasn't going anywhere. Meanwhile, across town, Samantha was grappling with her own thoughts. She sat on the edge of the couch, watching Oliver play with a soft rattle, his laughter filling the small apartment. It was a sound that always brought her comfort, but tonight, it carried a bittersweet edge. Matthew's absence was palpable. She had told herself that asking him to leave was for the best, that she was protecting herself and Oliver from disappointment. But as the days stretched into weeks, she couldn't ignore the gnawing regret. Matthew had been there for them, more than she ever thought he would be, and she had pushed him away out of fear. Samantha ran a hand through her hair, sighing. She thought of all the moments Matthew had spent with Oliver, feeding him, making him laugh, holding him close as though the rest of the world didn't matter. He hadn't just shown up out of obligation. He had genuinely cared. And not just about Oliver, about her, too. Her heart ached as she realized how much she had let her own insecurities blind her. Matthew had tried, and she had met his efforts with walls and doubts. She looked at Oliver, his wide eyes so full of innocence, and knew she owed him better than that. She owed them all better. The turning point came one chilly afternoon when Samantha was cleaning up Oliver's toys. As she folded a blanket, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Rachel. How long are you going to wait? He's not perfect, Sam, but neither are you. And that's okay. You two love that baby more than anything, maybe it's time to admit you're better together than apart." Samantha stared at the message for a long time, her throat tightening. Rachel was right. She had been so focused on protecting herself from potential heartbreak that she hadn't stopped to consider how much she was hurting Matthew, and herself, in the process. It was time to stop running. As the days turned into weeks, both Matthew and Samantha found themselves drawn back to the idea of trying again. Matthew, buoyed by the note and his growing resolve, decided to stop waiting for the right moment and create it instead. Samantha, driven by her realization and Rachel's gentle nudges, began to hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. The moment came on a crisp February afternoon. Samantha was walking home from the grocery store, Oliver bundled up in his stroller, when she spotted Matthew waiting near her building. Her heart leapt into her throat, and for a brief moment, she considered turning around. But then their eyes met, and she saw the determination in his. "Samantha," he said as she approached, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Can we talk?" She nodded, her pulse quickening as they stepped inside. Oliver, as if sensing the importance of the moment, remained unusually quiet as they settled into the living room. Matthew took a deep breath, meeting her gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, "for walking away. For not listening. For letting my own fears get in the way." Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand. "Please let me finish. I've spent weeks thinking about what I want, and it all comes back to you and Oliver. You're my family, Samantha. And I don't care about the challenges or the complications. I'm here because I want to be. Because I love you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Samantha felt like she couldn't breathe. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him, seeing the sincerity etched into every line of his face. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And I'm sorry for pushing you away. I was scared, Matthew. Scared of losing you, scared of letting myself hope. But I don't want to be scared anymore." Matthew reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You don't have to be," he said softly. "We'll figure it out together." And in that moment, as Oliver cooed happily between them, Samantha and Matthew both knew they had taken the first step toward a future worth fighting for. The weeks following Matthew's heartfelt confession brought a sense of calm to the fragile bond between him and Samantha. Their relationship, once strained and uncertain, now grew steadily stronger. Matthew spent more time at Samantha's apartment, helping with Oliver and sharing quiet evenings with her. Samantha, for her part, began to trust him more, her guarded demeanor softening as she allowed herself to imagine a future with him. Still, Matthew felt like he needed to do more. Samantha deserved to feel cherished, not just reassured. He had promised to be there for her and Oliver, but promises alone weren't enough. He wanted to show her, in a way that left no doubt in her mind, that they were his everything. The opportunity came in mid-March, on Samantha's birthday. Matthew had overheard her mentioning it in passing and immediately began planning. For someone as thoughtful and selfless as Samantha, her birthday seemed like the perfect moment to make his intentions unmistakably clear. The morning of her birthday dawned crisp and bright, and Samantha awoke to Oliver babbling happily in his crib. She smiled, scooping him up and pressing a kiss to his forehead. Her days were quieter now, but they were filled with joy, especially with Matthew in her life. Still, a part of her couldn't help but wonder what the day would bring. By late afternoon, she had settled onto the couch with Oliver when there was a knock at the door. Curious, she rose to answer it, holding Oliver in one arm as she opened the door. Matthew stood there, his arms full of flowers, balloons, and a wrapped box that was far too large to be practical. He looked slightly nervous but undeniably charming, his eyes lighting up as he saw her. "Happy birthday, Samantha," he said, his voice warm. Samantha's eyes widened in surprise, and she laughed softly. "Matthew, what is all this?" "This," he said, stepping inside and setting the items down, "is me trying to make up for the fact that I didn't even know it was your birthday last year. And also because you deserve to be celebrated." She shook her head, smiling. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," he said, his expression softening. But I wanted to. As she set Oliver down to crawl among his toys, Matthew reached for her hands. His gaze was steady, his voice low and earnest as he spoke. Samantha, I know I've made mistakes. I've been too caught up in my own fears, my own world, to see what really mattered. But I need you to know I love you. I love Oliver. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Whatever it takes, I'm here. For both of you. Tears welled in Samantha's eyes as she listened, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. She had spent so long building walls to protect herself, but Matthew's words, and his actions over the past few months, were slowly breaking them down. He wasn't just saying what she wanted to hear. He was showing her, in every way that mattered, that he meant it. I love you too, she said, her voice trembling. And I'm sorry for all the times I doubted you. You've been nothing but patient and kind, and I... She broke off, a tear slipping down her cheek. Matthew reached up to gently wipe it away, pulling her into his arms. For a long moment, they held each other, the weight of the past giving way to a newfound sense of peace and hope. Oliver, sensing the shift in energy, let out a delighted giggle, clapping his tiny hands together. They both laughed softly, pulling back just enough to look at him. Well, I think he approves, Matthew said, grinning. Samantha nodded, her smile wide and genuine. I think so too. The rest of the day passed in a blur of warmth and laughter. Matthew insisted on cooking dinner, though Samantha ended up helping when he nearly burned the sauce, and they spent the evening playing with Oliver and talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in a long while, Samantha felt completely at ease, her heart full. As the months continued to pass, the three of them fell into an easy rhythm, one that felt more and more like a family with each passing day. Matthew made adjustments to his demanding work schedule, ensuring he had time for Samantha and Oliver. Samantha, in turn, began to dream of a future that didn't feel so precarious. By the time the next New Year's Eve rolled around, their lives had transformed in ways either of them could have imagined. Matthew suggested they return to the bar where it all began, but Samantha had a better idea. Why don't we spend it here? She said one evening, her hand resting lightly on his. Just the three of us. Matthew smiled, nodding. I like that. When the evening arrived, Samantha and Matthew prepared a small celebration at her apartment. They dressed Oliver in a tiny suit Matthew had insisted on buying, and Samantha found herself laughing more that night than she had in years. They played music, danced with Oliver, and shared stories about the whirlwind of the past year. As midnight approached, Samantha and Matthew stood by the window, watching the city skyline come alive with fireworks. Oliver was nestled in Matthew's arms, his wide eyes captivated by the colorful bursts of light. Matthew turned to Samantha, his expression filled with gratitude and love. Thank you, he said softly. For what? She asked, tilting her head. For giving me this, he said, gesturing to the three of them. For trusting me. For letting me in. Samantha smiled, her hand reaching up to cup his cheek. Thank you for proving I could. As the clock struck midnight, they kissed, the promise they'd made a year ago fulfilled in ways they never could have imagined. Fireworks lit up the sky, casting a warm glow over the small apartment as they stood together, a family at last. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright, full of hope, love, and endless possibilities. And as they held each other close, Samantha and Matthew knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. The glow of fireworks painted the room with flashes of red, gold, and silver as Matthew, Samantha, and Oliver stood by the window, watching the city light up in celebration. The clock had struck midnight, marking the beginning of another year, their first as a family. Samantha leaned her head against Matthew's shoulder, her fingers brushing lightly against his. This is perfect, she said softly. I don't think I've ever had a New Year's Eve like this. Neither have I, Matthew replied, turning his head to kiss the top of her hair. But you know, I was thinking about where we were 2 years ago. Samantha tilted her head to look at him, her smile curious. The bar. He nodded, a wistful smile spreading across his face. Yeah. I was sitting there, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life showing up. And then I saw you. And I had no idea that one night would lead to this," she said, glancing down at Oliver, who was starting to drift off in her arms. Matthew chuckled. "Neither did I. But it did. And I think we should go back." "To the bar?" Samantha asked, raising an eyebrow. "Next New Year's," he said, his tone light but thoughtful. "I think it could be fun. A way to honor where we started while celebrating how far we've come." Samantha hesitated, her eyes softening as she considered the idea. "You know I like that," she said after a moment. "It could be our tradition." Matthew smiled, brushing his fingers along Oliver's tiny hand. "Our tradition," he repeated, the words filling the room with promise. And so, as the first New Year's Eve they spent together came to an end, the idea of returning to the bar the following year was planted, not as a step backward, but as a way to celebrate the journey they'd taken to become a family. The following New Year's Eve arrived with a chill in the air and a dusting of snow that coated the city streets in a shimmering blanket. Samantha adjusted Oliver's tiny hat, securing it over his head as she bundled him tightly in his stroller. The bar where she and Matthew had first met was just a few blocks away, and tonight they were going back. Matthew had suggested the idea weeks ago. "It feels right," he'd said, the corners of his mouth lifting into a soft smile. "It's where everything started, after all." Samantha had hesitated at first, unsure if returning to that bar, a place that had held so much uncertainty and yet so much hope, would feel the same. But as the day grew closer, the idea began to feel less like a nostalgic trip and more like a celebration of how far they had come. "You ready?" Matthew asked, stepping out of their building to meet them. His scarf was loosely draped around his neck, his breath visible in the frosty air. He leaned down to adjust Oliver's blanket before looking up at Samantha with that familiar, grounding smile. She nodded, her heart warming despite the cold. "Let's do this." The bar was just as they remembered it, unassuming, tucked into a quiet corner of the bustling city. The warm glow of its lights spilled onto the sidewalk, and the faint hum of music reached them before they even stepped inside. Matthew held the door open for Samantha, his hand resting lightly on her back as they entered. The atmosphere was lively but intimate, just as it had been that first night. A mix of laughter, conversation, and clinking glasses filled the air. Samantha couldn't help but smile as memories of that evening washed over her, the tentative way they'd spoken at first, the unexpected ease that had followed, and the promise they'd made without knowing where it might lead. Matthew found them a table near the back, where the noise was softer and they could talk without interruption. He helped Samantha settle Oliver, who was now wide awake and taking in the sights with wide, curious eyes. "This feels surreal," Samantha said, glancing around. "Being back here, but so much has changed." Matthew reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "In the best way," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "A year ago, I didn't think I'd ever feel this kind of happiness again. And now." He trailed off, his gaze falling to Oliver, who let out a small squeal as if in agreement. Samantha laughed softly, her heart swelling with gratitude. She hadn't expected this, hadn't imagined a life where she could feel so safe, so loved. But Matthew had made it possible, one small, steady step at a time. As the night went on, they shared stories and laughter, the conversation flowing easily between them. Matthew insisted on ordering the same drink he'd had the night they'd met, and Samantha teased him about how terrible his memory was when he got it wrong. Oliver, meanwhile, became the star of the evening, charming everyone who walked by their table. When the countdown to midnight began, Matthew pulled Samantha close, his arm around her shoulders as they stood together, watching the bar's patrons cheer and celebrate. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Do you remember what you said to me that night?" he asked. Samantha turned to him, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "You mean when I told you looked like you needed that drink more than I did?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Not that. At the end of the night. The promise we made." Her smile softened as she nodded. If we were still single, we'd meet here again. And here we are, Matthew said, his voice dropping to a whisper. But not as strangers. As a family. Tears pricked the corners of Samantha's eyes, and she reached up to cup his cheek. I never thought I'd find this again. I never thought I'd find you. You didn't just find me, Matthew said, his gaze steady and filled with love. You saved me. As the clock struck midnight, they kissed, the noise of the bar fading into the background. It wasn't the first New Year's kiss they'd shared, but this one felt different. It wasn't a promise of what might be, it was a celebration of everything they had built together. Oliver let out a delighted squeal, pulling them both out of the moment. They laughed, turning their attention to him as he clapped his tiny hands together, clearly enjoying the excitement around him. Matthew leaned down, pressing a kiss to Oliver's forehead. Happy New Year, buddy, he said softly. Samantha rested her head against Matthew's shoulder, her heart full as she watched the fireworks light up the sky outside the window. This was their new tradition, one they had created together. And as the three of them stood there, wrapped in the warmth of their love and the hope of a new year, Samantha knew without a doubt that they had everything they needed. They had each other. And that was more than enough. As the fireworks lit up the sky and another new year began, Matthew, Samantha, and Oliver stood together as a family, celebrating not just the night but the journey that had brought them there. Their story is a testament to the power of second chances, the courage to be vulnerable, and the beauty of creating new traditions together. What started as a fleeting connection had blossomed into a bond that would carry them through all the years to come. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more stories about love, resilience, and life's unexpected twists. Let us know in the comments, what's your favorite part of Matthew and Samantha's journey? And what traditions do you cherish with your loved ones? Here's to fresh starts, unexpected connections, and a future full of possibility. See you in the next video.